We have come to our final lesson on congruent triangles. Today we're going to talk about a theorem that applies specifically to right triangles. Before we begin, I want to make sure you understand some vocabulary. First of all, we need to know what a right triangle is, and that's a triangle with a right angle. The two sides that create the right angle are called legs, and the side opposite the right angle is called the hypotenuse. Now that we know the information about right triangles, this is the basic vocabulary we need to know in order to understand the theorem. This is the hypotenuse-leg triangle congruence theorem, also known as HL. If the hypotenuse and leg of one triangle are congruent to the hypotenuse and leg of another triangle, then the two triangles are congruent. Notice that we don't use the word right triangle in our theorem. The reason why is because only right triangles have hypotenuses. So if you see the word hypotenuse, then you know that the triangle is a right triangle. What does this look like using a conditional and our geometric symbols? Well, let's take a look. If triangle PQR and triangle XYZ are right triangles, and segment PR is congruent to segment XZ, and segment PQ is congruent to XY, then triangle PQR is congruent to triangle XYZ. Of course, it's a theorem, so we have to prove it. I'm just going to outline this proof. For you today. If you're feeling so inclined, you can prove it yourself. Notice that we are given that we have right triangles and that angle Q and angle XYZ are right angles, and the hypotenuses, segment PR and segment XZ, are congruent, and two legs, segment PQ and segment XY, are congruent. Now the first thing that we're going to do in order to prove this is extend segment ZY so that segment YS is congruent to segment QR. Remember, we can do that because we can construct congruent segments. Now, can you see that triangle XYS is congruent to triangle PQR by side, angle, side? That means that segment XS is congruent to segment PR by definition of congruent polygons. Oh, wow! Now we can see that triangle SXZ is isosceles. Notice that segment XS and segment XZ are congruent. Well, now we can use the isosceles triangle theorem to prove that angle S and angle Z are congruent. Oh, now with those congruent angles that we just proved, the right angles are congruent to each other by the right angle congruency theorem. We can prove that triangle XYS and triangle XYZ are congruent by angle, angle, side. So now we can use the transitive property of congruence to prove that triangle PQR is congruent to triangle XYZ. Okay, so that's an outline of the proof. The actual proof would be a little bit more extensive. Now, in order to prove the hypotenuse-leg theorem, you must have two congruent hypotenuses. Obviously, in order to have hypotenuses, you must have two right triangles. And of course, along with those hypotenuses and right triangles, you have to have two congruent legs. Okay, so notice that there are three parts So notice, even with hypotenuse leg, there are 3 corresponding parts that are congruent in these triangles. So let's use it. You've been asked to measure the bridge in the picture to the right. Your tape measure won't go clear across the bridge, however, you were able to measure the diagonal struts across the top up there, and they're the same length. You also know that the support is perpendicular to the bridge. Do you need to measure clear across the bridge? Let me think about that. No. And the reason why is the perpendicular supports means that you have right triangles. Okay, the support is congruent to itself by the reflexive property of congruence. Hey, that's a leg of a right triangle. The struts being congruent means that the hypotenuses of the right triangles are congruent. So our hypotenuse-leg theorem applies. So all that you have to do is measure from one shore to the strut and double that length. Voila! We have used congruent right triangles to measure clear across this bridge. It is now your turn to try your hand at using the hypotenuse-leg theorem. Let's see how well you do, and then you can move on to the next video.